Welcome to the OShow. I'm Laura Babcock, and there are so many scandals that have erupted in the Ford government in the last couple of weeks. I'm just going to go right to our OShow Scandal Panel, to Mark Cripps, of course, who was both a journalist and also an insider in the very ministries that we've been talking about for the last few months in the Greenbelt scandal. So welcome back, Mark. It's wonderful to have your perspective. And to Keith Leslie, who's kind of riffing a little bit of Sean Connery. I got to tell you, Keith, I'm digging the beard.
Well, thank you. I'll take that.
What is at the top of your list to talk about in the Ford scandals from since we last spoke?
Well, to me, it's the healthcare stuff. I mean, we knew they wanted to privatize healthcare, more actual surgeries, not just, some sort of little things. No, private surgical clinics. We knew they wanted to do that. And Mike Crawley from CBC Queen's Park did some FOI digging and come up with the actual rates that they're going to pay. They are already paying some of these private clinics to do surgeries that are done in the public system, surgeries that could still be done in the public system if they were funded to keep the operating rooms open past, say, 4 p.m. Right. But this government has decided it wants to go down the road of privatization to have these. They say it's going to, help speedily reduce these waiting lists for certain procedures. Apparently, it's not going to do that. And it's definitely not going to reduce the cost from what we've seen this week, because basically what the CBC reported is, and they had the actual figures, it's basically 2 to 4 times we're going to pay the private clinics to do the exact same procedures that are done in our public hospitals, 2 to 4 times. Now, one of the more established ones of these is the ClearPoint Health Network. They own and operate, they bought it in 2019, the Don Mills surgical thing, which was one of those grandfather clinics in. But their budget under then Health Minister Christine Elliott went from like 120 million or 103 million, I think it was, a year, up to $523 million a year. Now, there was COVID. There was, I'm sure, some reasons for it. But then we find out that, barely a year after she leaves the job as Minister of Health, she is now registered to lobby for ClearPoint Health Network. And one of the goals in her lobbying registry is to increase public funding for this private health network. Now, even better, let's make it, one little extra bit kick in the whatever. This place is owned by a private equity firm out of the States. And I know everyone thinks it was the internet that killed local newspapers. Well, it was private equity firms that came in the 1990s and bought out all the family-owned newspapers and looked for 10 to 15% return each year. And how did you get that? You got the places. You got them down to next to nothing. And then in the end, well, of course, they couldn't survive the competition. There was nothing left barely with them to fight back with. This same money is going to be taken out of our public healthcare system and going to private equity investors in the United States. Isn't that charming? And at 2 to 4 times the rate. And Christine Elliott, barely a year out of the job, and she said, it took her a week. She let her government hang in the wind on this one for a week before finally issuing a statement that said, well, I checked with the Integrity Commissioner when I left, and this follows all the rules. Well, the rule is 1 year and don't lobby. After that, you can do whatever you want pretty much. And if she checked before she left, this must have been a long-term plan.
Right.
To become a registered lobbyist. So, it's not, as she said, she's followed all the rules. But the smell check here, especially after this particular company got so much of an increase in public funding, her goal is to get even more of that public funding. And the government, what's its justification for paying 2 to 4 times as much per procedure? Now, yes, people want to speed these up, and most people, if you're on a waiting list, you want to get this done as quickly as possible. Well, that money at 2 to 4 times, as I said, could fund the closed operating rooms in our hospitals, our public hospitals. And by the way, when you take the doctors away from that, and let's face it, doctors and nurses are going to go to these private clinics. Why wouldn't they? Better hours. And that also means the doctors don't have to do things like volunteer for emergency surgeries on a rotation. With the other doctors, you have to be on rotation to take care of emergency surgeries. If you don't have hospital credentials, all sorts of different things, you aren't there for that hospital any longer. You're now in the private system. All of this to serve private equity firms. I don't know. I know you like to use the word corruption, Laura, and I know it offends you greatly, but all of this is perfectly above board. It's just sad. I'll go with sad. No.
Yeah. So where I use the word corruption is there's definitions of corruption, right? And then when I call it corruption in the Ford government, it's about lying and deceit. I mean, that is considered corruption. That's malfeasance in government. Am I accusing them of anything illegal? No. Telling us that they're going to fix healthcare and then doing something that is obviously not fixing healthcare. They had a record number of complaints this year to the Ombudsman of Ontario, like a huge jump, I think over 33%. So they're not fixing healthcare, and they are gutting it. They are in fact enfeebling it. They're enfeebling public healthcare to enrich these private equity firms, their donor class. We saw this with the Greenbelt scandal. Now we're seeing it. We've got the receipts in healthcare that this is what they're up to.
We saw the privately owned long-term care homes had a far more disastrous mortality rate and illness rate from COVID than the publicly owned ones. So we're going to make more of our healthcare system go down this as opposed to backing that away and go more public?
Because the public are not getting anything better for their money. They're not getting it, their tax dollars, their hard-earned tax dollars invested well by this government. If they're paying 2 to 4 times what they could be paying in the public sector just by keeping operating rooms open. Not surprising, given that we've seen these other schemes with the Greenbelt that the RCMP is looking into, may or may not be illegal, may be okay technically, but certainly stink to high heaven. So I'm not surprised that it's also happening in healthcare, but it is shocking that they make the claims that they're going to help the system, and then we find out just how they're spending our money. Over to you, Mark.
I will pivot to a couple of others potential or what I would consider scandals. Number one is the multiple phone, not using government phones. There is an expectation that if you are an elected official conducting government business, that you should use the tools that are provided to you so that you are freely being part of the accountability and transparency of government. That's why you're there. You are there to be accountable and transparent. So this one really is really gross. And then the second thing I would say that I don't think is getting a lot of attention, because I think a lot of people are thinking that the new legislation to roll back all the municipal boundary impositions that the Ford government did. Great. Awesome. Great news. Guess what? Read the legislation. 3/4 of it is about liability immunity for everybody involved in any of the decisions made around allocating these lands for development. So this now basically clears the slate. So there won't be any lawsuits that potentially that could come out of the last wasted 2 years, which brings me back to the most important point. We have wasted 2 freaking years in a housing crisis with this bullshit, and nothing's getting built. And the recommendations of the housing task force have not been adopted. What? This government needs to be held account for its, we need to build houses, and then they attack the federal government for doing some of the work for them, right? It blows me away how they are. Yeah, now I'm more mad about anything that the housing that we needed hasn't even gotten started because of this joke show that's been going on for the last 2 years.
Looked at the health minister the month she was announcing the privatization of these new surgical clinics. She had 0 minutes on her cell phone, on her government cell phone. The education minister, when he was in bargaining with the teachers, he had 1 minute on his cell phone. Right. Finance minister apparently had 2 when he was doing his pre-budget consultations. So it's not as if nothing was going on. And apparently Microsoft Teams just replaced the cell phone technology. Most of us just didn't realize that or didn't get that memo. That's they're doing. This is nonsense. And what really, really undermines their claims here is the photographs in the legislature every day of, the housing minister, Paul Calandra has 2 phones on his desk. Right. And some of the other ministers, there's at least 4 of them sitting there in the open with 2 phones. What does your personal phone need to be out there between when you're sitting in the legislature? Are you doing government business or on your personal phone? Why else would it be there? Why else would you have 2 phones? You have your government phone, which I would think would be the one you're using. They work long hours, let's say 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. That would be the one you're using, not in the legislature during question period. You've got 2 phones on your desk. That alone says it all. One is because we can FOI what's on one of them, and on the others, we do not have that right because it's your private business. So clearly the allegation, and it seems really kind of obvious, is that government business is being conducted on private cell phones to avoid scrutiny, to avoid public transparency, which is the whole point of these things in the first place.
It's shady as shit. That's what I treat. Like, it's shady as shit. And part of the problem with this is that it's so flagrant. It's so flagrant. And I can't help but think that if they hadn't gone for that greedy little grab of the stag and doe, we would have never found out about the Greenbelt scandal. We would never be doing this level of digging into all the other potential corruption and scandalous behavior of this government. And now that we are, Ontarians are looking at it going, that is shady as shit. I might not be somebody who understands politics and polity, and I might not be, somebody who's done this or paid attention my whole life, but I know what it looks like when it looks like you got a burner phone or it looks like you got a second phone. I mean, who does that, right? Who
Stag and Doe raised over $100,000.
What's that?
The Stag and Doe raised over $100,000.
Right. And I guess that's a lot of money, but to this government, given the amount of cash we're seeing flowing to what looks like private enterprises or hedge funds or whatever else, it doesn't look like a lot. But that $100,000 decision to say, let's get what we can, let's squeeze where we can, that is really what opened this up. And that's often how, isn't that the anatomy of a scandal, guys? Right? It's the little things that those little things that don't feel right. And people go, huh? What's going on there?
You start pulling that first thread.
Right. That's right. And so, kudos to all the journalists who have been pulling those threads. And, thank God the RCMP is on this. But, Keith, I don't know if you realize, and maybe we can speak to it, Hamilton Council went forward, right? They want the RCMP to also look into the MZOs. Right. And so how far do you think, Keith, the RCMP investigation is going to stretch? Do you think it will also now go into these healthcare, what look like overpays? Right. Do you think that it's going to extend into what we found out this week?
Well, it's hard to know what the RCMP and how broad they think their mandate would be, but I would think the MZOs absolutely would fall under that because it was done on the same day as the Greenbelt land swap. And it is essentially the same result. We were going to greatly increase the value of lands requested by developers to have those specific land changed in designation to get those values increased and then ostensibly open them up for development. But as we saw in another report, I think it was the Star did this one, that MZOs from 2019 to 2021 resulted in zero housing being built. So all these things given out like candy to their friend developers, their donor friends and all this stuff, didn't get any housing built. And back to the previous point, years wasted with this MZOs, and now we've got the police. And what kind of money is that spending? And the government's got, of course, they're spending a lot of money getting countered, having messaging ready to counter whatever the police come up with, and that's why we're seeing these huge climb downs on the Greenbelt, on the MZO, on the municipal boundary expansions. All of that's all over the place. So I think all of that would absolutely be in the RCMP scope for looking at the Greenbelt land swap. Whether then they would expand that over to the healthcare sector, which many of us would love. I think probably the best way there is going to be, again, for public requests and opposition requests to go through the Auditor General, the Integrity Commissioner, and the Ombudsman. And that sort of stuff, as we've now seen, builds momentum. And now we have the Auditor General looking at Ontario Place and the Science Center. All these build momentum. So that gives hope. That is nothing else. It gives hope, especially when we've seen a government that is now more than willing to pivot and just, okay, sorry, and they'll probably do it again when they have to, because when they did pivot on the Greenbelt land swap, their numbers went back up. People went, okay, he made a mistake. People aren't as into the weeds as we are on this, right? So overall, if you would make a mistake and back down, it's paid off for Ford. So we may see him do it again, and I think that gives people hope in many ways.
I'm almost thinking they're at the point where there's so many scandals. It's that strategy of flood the zone with bullshit, right? Just keep so much stuff out there that we all get exhausted trying to hold accountability. And one thing is more outrageous than the next. And you get to a point of like, forget it, whatever. And you just kind of disengage. So it almost feels like, whether that's an accidental strategy or if that's just what's happening, that's what's happening. So I encourage all of our OShow viewers to don't give up. Listen to what Keith says. There is hope. There are more investigations going into this government. It's almost as though, to use the analogy, there's blood in the water, right? And now everyone can smell it, and the sharks are moving. I'm not equating the media to sharks, but everybody is moving in and saying, what is happening? And so there's hope there. We have seen this government reverse themselves, and I'm more of a pragmatist in that sense than I am an ideologue. If the lands get back in the Greenbelt, if the MZOs get stopped, if the developers don't get these deals, if the 413 does not go forward because there's so much corruption, if Ontario Place does not get ripped apart because of all of this, good, and he can fight to get reelected. I really don't care. I want to reverse the bad things, the malfeasance, the things that are hurting people. And I want this government to focus on getting rid of healthcare in the hallways and actually giving our system the funding it needs. I want them to focus on the housing crisis and get these homes started like Olivia Chow is trying to do for Toronto. I want to see them get to the business of the people and stop getting in the business of their buddies. And if that is something that can happen because of all these investigations, then I do, in fact, have some hope. What do you think their plan is right now? What's their strategy?
I think you kind of nailed it a bit with flooding the zone. I think they believe that is the path to, wearing people down and, like having so much there. So I honestly don't think, I think they will back down on things. And I think Ford is really, I think Keith mentioned this, that Ford gets a lot of, I don't know, like people just, his folksy ways still resonate with many voters. And, when he says he's sorry, we made a mistake, people are more willing to forgive. So the Auditor General report on Ontario Place is going to be fascinating. That's going to be a whole new ball of wax for them to deal with. As the 413, the highways get closer, those same connections to the same people are going to be brought to the surface again, and there will be this similar outrage. I think you're right in many ways. I think the flooding the zone is working, and they're leaning into the scandals now versus like running away from them, right? So
that's right. So I think the only way, and I posted this, to not have that strategy work, the flooding the zone thing, is for us to refuse to let this behavior be normalized. We should remain shocked every time we see something, not surprised because we've seen the patterns, but shocked by the level of brazenness, shocked by the level of inefficiency, shocked by sometimes the mendacity or the malfeasance. It should shock us. We should not accept that this is the new norm and that this is okay. They can fight on their record in the next election, but until then, every single one of these, we've got to follow, we've got to speak to, we've got to be shocked about, we've got to tell our friends about. And that is what I do. I say to people, it's not just about the OShow or about Twitter posts or whatever else. I talk to my friends and neighbors. And I got to tell you, and I want to end on this with you, Keith, and where you think this is all going to go before we meet again. And on this idea, I think why some people are ready to forgive Ford for anything is because they don't want to vote for an alternative, because they're hard set against NDP, and they don't have a Liberal leader that inspires, because of course the last election, why on earth would they put that Liberal leader up? I don't get it, didn't get it then. So if the Liberal leadership race comes out, and we might talk to whoever is elected or selected on the OShow, if there is a Liberal leader who looks as though possibly there's another alternative to vote for in Ontario, I think there are a lot of Ontarians who are like, okay, you know what? I got to get off this Ford train because it's pissing me off, because I can't stand hearing about this corruption with my money anymore. I know what that looks like to have two phones. I don't like this anymore. But they need an alternative, whether that's Merritt or the new Liberal leader. I think that, that's part of why Ford's getting the pass, because people just don't think that there's someone else they can get behind. So can you answer to that theory? And then we'll wrap it up on where you think this is all going to go next.
The Liberal leadership is going to benefit from what Merritt Stiles didn't benefit from, which is a leadership race with candidates and debates. They've now got 100,000 members eligible to vote. That's huge. That's really big for the Liberal Party. It shows that they've got money coming back to them. They've got volunteers coming back to them. That means come the next election, especially they're going to have 2 years to build, 2.5 years to build before the next election campaign, they're going to be in a real position. So assuming they pick Bonnie Crummy, that's a big assumption, I know, but if she takes it, especially on the first ballot, she is the one that Doug Ford and the Conservatives are most worried about. She is the biggest fundraiser by far. So again, she could put the Liberals onto a strong, government in waiting footing, stronger than anyone else. And Merritt Stiles is still, in that, here I am. Oh, and by the way, my party's shooting itself in both feet at the same time, especially in the Kitchener by-election. Just, on an issue that has nothing to do with Queen's Park. So the Liberals absolutely have an avenue here, a path to come right up the middle. The publicity is going to help them. Picking a new leader on December 2nd, that's going to get some publicity. The legislature is still going to be sitting. Now, whoever that new leader is, they have a big challenge ahead of them. I'm not saying they're coming back from 7 seats in the 2018 and 8 seats last time. they're not, it's going to be a big jump to them, but they can present themselves as a government, an alternative government in waiting. And the NDP are having trouble presenting that face right now. So I think politically, I think the Liberals are in great shape and the Conservatives are worried about that because, as we've all talked about, there's just so many things that thread is still unraveling, the drip, drip, drip of the various scandals. And I think the healthcare one will take on traction because they promised to end hallway healthcare. And we're hearing reports of people being triaged in the parking garage because they can't even get into the hallway at this point. So they haven't ended it, have they? It's gotten much, much worse. And part of that, a big part of that is funding. And to the federal funding thing, the federal healthcare funding isn't all going through to healthcare. So when Sean Fraser goes out and gives checks directly to cities, they get upset about this, and the cities are not upset about this. If you could cut a check this quick, we could get some stuff done. So it's ridiculous. Sean Fraser's become a big star across the country. He's doing something on housing. No one even knew who the federal housing minister was before. They've jumped right to the front of this. Time for the Ford government to step up, stop talking, and stop delaying and being on the defensive and actually get something built on this. But whether they can, politically, they're really vulnerable right now.
And they're also vulnerable, since we're talking raw politics for a second, because at least in Ontario, there is a pattern of not wanting to have a Conservative federally and a Conservative provincially. And Poilievre at this point looks like he's going to get a majority of seats, which means that it could be a Conservative federal government. And it's going to mean a lot of people in Ontario are going to go, no, enough Conservative in Ontario. I mean, that's a real traditional voting consideration anyway that might play into all this. But I just want to hear from you, Keith, just as we wrap up. What do you prognosticate a little bit for me? What do you think is the next biggest event that's going to happen, news event, scandal event, or risk for the Ford government?
Ooh, good gosh. I mean, I really can't tell at this point. I think the details, the Auditor General's report into the MZOs and into Ontario Place is going to be more trouble. It's more mad, as Mark says. It's all the same players in many sense, although the 95-year lease to Therme is a different player altogether. But that Therme lease and of course, the last time they did a 99-year lease on the 407, that begs the question, on the 413, when they get this done, are they going to lease that out for 100 years to somebody else? It really does. Are they going to be in competition with the other highway? Because they're not supposed to be in competition as Conservatives with the other highway. So what's the long-term goal on this one? So there's just so much. I think, as I say, the focus for the short term will be still the Greenbelt, the MZOs, and the municipal boundary stuff. But that healthcare stuff, it's gonna keep coming, and the more people learn about it, the more people see these specific fee rates that we're paying to private equity companies in the long run, it's not going to sit well with anything. It's one thing to take a little bit of public money out to get faster delivery. We're not getting that. We're getting a worse result and losing a lot of money.
Well said. And I have to say on Merit, I've seen tremendous effort from Merit, whether or not the people buy the proposition of the NDP party and their internal politics and everything else. She is standing up and putting out every single day attacks on the Ford government, as she should. But I think a much more robust opposition than we saw from her predecessor, Andrea Horwath, in that role. And I think that, she's grabbing onto this with both hands and helping all of us have the facts that we need to do our analysis. So I think she deserves credit for that. And so I just want to end the show by saying, you guys have, as always, brought forward a lot of things for us to all consider and some hope about, the need to stay on this. But what I'm really taking away from today's show, gentlemen, is that the Conservative government have now shown us who they are under Doug Ford. They've shown us who they are. They've shown us what is precious to them and what is not. And what is precious to them is enriching their donors, their members of the party, current and past, that inner circle. They are enriching the elites and the wealthy, and at the expense, we're now seeing, of our public healthcare system, at the expense of getting our housing crisis under control and investing in communities. They are doing it at the expense of the public. And once people show you who they are, believe them. Right? To quote a very famous line. And also, it'll be up to them to make their case for the Ontario people and their votes, but it's up to all of us to hold them to account, to not get tired, to not get worn down. That we can't. This is our money and this is our lives and this is our future. Maybe it'll be 2 weeks till I have you back, gentlemen. Who knows in Ford's Ontario? But I always appreciate your contributions, and all of you who are subscribing and watching these panels. Our scandal panels are getting some incredible numbers of you who are very engaged, and it's going to take all of us. Stay safe. Have a wonderful couple of weeks, guys, or until we meet again.
Terrific. Thank you.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the Show. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the O Show. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the O Show. It's the O Show. Laura Babcock's the O Show. With a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the O Show. There's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the O Show. Stand for something or fall for it all. Ontario, hear the call on the O Show. It's a podcast, the O Show. Laura Babcock's the O Show. Stay informed with the O Show, O Show.